Hello. Today we'll be discussing the following topics: U.S. relations with Latin America by Andres, Latin American foreign policy by Alejandro, and Chinese relations with Latin America by Eggy. But first, why are relations with Latin America so important? Latin America is becoming more and more relevant as a supplier of raw materials to developed nations, but it has always been a key player. Latin America contains resources that have changed the course of history. Throughout time, countries such as the United States and more recently China have begun exploiting the region and taking advantage of its vast resources. The lack of modernization in agriculture and industrialization of Latin American countries have given these superpowers a competitive advantage. Some of these resources include, in Chile, copper and lithium; in Brazil, iron ore, crude petroleum, soybeans, and raw sugar; Guatemala, sugar, coffee, rice, and tropical fruits; in Mexico, oil, silver, fruits, and vegetables; and in Panama, copper, gold, and hydropower; in Peru, copper, gold, and zinc; and lastly, in Colombia, oil, coal, nickel, gold, coffee, bananas, and other substances. Beginning in the 16th century and throughout the 19th century, it accounted for 80% of the world's silver, boosting China's monetary system. More recently, in 2000, trade between China and Latin America was estimated to be at $10 billion, but in 2011 it had grown to $241 billion. Of course, the benefits incurred from this are mutual, and this trade growth has helped Latin America avoid financial crises that would have otherwise plummeted its economy due to the political corruption. Eggy will take us more into detail later in the video. On the other hand, relations with the United States began with the Monroe Doctrine that Andres will go into more detail about. This basically warned against the establishment of any additional European colonies in Latin America in 1823. Another known policy regarding relations with Latin America would be adopted in the 1930s with the Good Neighbor policy. This policy would ensure the amicable trade relations with the region despite the political conditions and the development of dictatorships in Latin America of that time. Now Andres will go into the ties between the United States and Latin America.
The United States and U.S. relations with Latin America. The United States has been a very important player for the Latin American region and as well for their economic growth. The United States started to see Latin America back in the 1800s as a rich resource for them to extract from. Now, we can see in history in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was implied by the U.S. And what's the Monroe Doctrine? Well, it's the U.S. policy of opposing European colonialism in the Americas. And it stated that further efforts by European countries to take control of any independent state, north or south, will be viewed as a manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. Now, and we can see, the United States' intentions to be involved in Latin America. Now, their main argument, of course, was to be in control of the whole Western Hemisphere. Now, the problem with the doctrine, with the Monroe Doctrine policy, it was back in those days, the United States wasn't powerful enough. However, the United States have the wonderful idea of waiting for the superpowers to become weak, and the United States can't interfere. A good example is in Cuba in 1898, the United States interfered in the Cuban affairs in order for them to gain independence from Spain. Now, and the reason why is because many would say that they didn't do it because they want to be the superhero and save the world. No, the United States aimed their eyes at Cuba because they knew that Cuba was going to be a good economic resource for the United States. They were rich in sugar and tobacco. Now, of course, they helped gain independence from Spain. The Cubans were thankful, and of course, that's the beginning of, the relations between the Caribbean and Latin America. Now, skip a few years later, 1903, the French were constructing the Panama Canal, and and the French couldn't do it, so the United States stepped in. Panama, in back in the day, Panama and Colombia were one country, meaning that Panama was part of Colombia. Now, the United States made the offer to Colombia to build the Panama Canal. The Colombia say no because they were afraid of U.S. imperialism. The United States took this as offensive, and what they did is there were some nationalists in Panama that wanted to get independence from Colombia. The United States supported them, backed them up, and Panama, gained their independence. Now, good strategy for the United States because Colombia out of the picture, they can build the Panama Canal, which in the future will bring lots of millions of billions of dollars to the United States economy. Now, after World War II, the United States showed that it is the most powerful nation in the world. And many of the Latin American countries wanted to look at the United States as the perfect role model for the developing countries. Good in economy, superpower, and of course, the United States was investing in the region. Now, the United States relations with Latin America has been somewhat complicated because the United States imposed their imperialism and they get into the affairs of Latin America. Even Theodore Roosevelt said that the United States has the right to interfere in Latin American affairs. So now we have our big daddy. If our country does anything, we will get spanked. Moving a few years later, and we see that Latin America is investing and also giving aids. For example, let's take Colombia. During the Clinton-Bush administration, the United States sent help to Colombia and to combat the left guerrilla groups. This was called the Plan Colombia. Colombia is one of the top nations in Latin America who received the most aid of the United States. However, turning the page on the other side, we have the socialism of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, which in partnership with Correa from Ecuador and Morales from Bolivia, they oppose imperialism. So, unfortunately, the U.S. relations with Latin America is not that great with some of the countries, but for the most part, it is an important key role. So I'm going to have my next teammate explain the other video.
Hi everyone, my name is Alejandro Cardona and I'll be talking about Latin American foreign policy. For this discussion, I've decided to use Colombia and Venezuela as examples. If you have been up to the date with the news, you will know that both countries are currently under turmoil. Colombia has been infamous for its peace treaty with this rebel group known as the guerrilla. This peace treaty affects more than Colombia itself. It affects its foreign relations. For instance, relationship with the U.S. change over time as either a Republican or a Democrat president takes the White House. We see that with the Republican president, they are very tough on the discussion of the terrorist group guerrilla. The United States aided Colombia in the 1980s with the so-called War on Drugs. This plan that originated fighting Pablo Escobar and other infamous drug dealers has turned to fighting the guerrilla. Plan Colombia is a diplomatic aid initiative aimed at combating drugs and helping isolate the leftist group, Guerrilla and ELN. It is an anti-cocaine strategy that was supposed to help both countries reduce the cartels and gangs run by mobs. The plan was set in place with the President of Colombia, Andres Pastrana, and U.S. President Bill Clinton. It was a plan put in place strategically, but yearly costs would rise. The Uribe administration was winning the war in 2002 when he won the presidency. Uribe had to deal with a very big leftist group that numbered at around 27,000 soldiers in the mountains. With the help of Plan Colombia and using that money to rebuild its military, Colombia reduced the number of leftist guerrilla to just 7,000 by the end of Álvaro Uribe's second term in office. It was a dream that seemed impossible to have in his early days of his presidency, but accomplished with the help of the USA and the European Union. Uribe's popularity in the country was over 80% throughout his term and was posed to seek re-election for his third term, but later rejected by the Colombian Supreme Court. President Bush was Colombia's closest ally in Latin America, which helped somewhat defeat the war on drugs. Before Bush's second term in the office, The USA recognized Uribe's resilience to combating terrorism and war on drugs and awarded him with the high honor of Medal of Freedom, one of the few high-ranking officials to earn it in 2008. The U.S. relationship was at its highest point in years. When Barack Obama took office, the U.S. government considered setting a different plan on the war on drugs. It was a plan to open negotiations for peace with the leftist guerrilla, replacing the current attack strategy. In 2008, Alvaro Uribe was still in office, but had with a totally different mindset than that of Obama. Uribe, in the late 2008, was eradicating the leftist guerrilla almost to its knees, as many war soldiers from the leftist group vanished and turned themselves into programs of reintegration. It seemed that the plan was working, but a bigger problem was developing. There was reports of false positives that was staining the Uribe administration. It seemed that the Colombian military were pressed so hard into combating these leftist groups that they were killing innocent civilians for the numbers. The Uribe administration was under attack, and the U.S. with the new Obama administration was not supporting him like they had done so many times before. The U.S. government was waiting for its next presidential elections to propose a better strategy to end war once for once. In 2010, when Juan Manuel Santos won the presidency, Uribe assumed the policies would be enforced with very little change. That's what many political scientists thought. And the own Colombian people that voted for his campaign promises that seemed to erode in his first days of presidency. Santos, winning as a right wing, was slowly winging itself into the left. His presidency opened negotiations in stabilizing a border with Venezuela, which was locked due to the poor relationship these two countries had with Uribe. Many world leaders, especially in Latin America, were surprised that Santos appeared to transition into a different leader than he thought to be from his campaign. He was open to having a peace treaty with the FARC, and that's when everything changed. Many people were in disagreement with him, and the Colombian politics split into sides. Alvaro Uribe heavily criticized his stance against the FARC, as statistically the FARC grew more and more, and less combat was seeped into Santos' administration. The Colombian Peace Treaty was exactly what the Obama administration wanted, and now it was time to open up dialogue with the leftists and once and for all to put the guns down. With the full Obama support, the plan was put into referendum in which the Colombian people voted for. It was declined by a tight margin. People weren't really sure what was to think of the guerrilla having power in the Senate. It was cause for an investment to go down, something that would be catastrophic for Colombia. Foreign investment has declined since Santos took office, something in which many people say it's due from the political or democratic instability that these peace treaties has left in its trail. Yet this treaty is supported by the countries such as USA, Spain, Ecuador, Venezuela, and many more countries in Latin America and around the world. When the peace treaty was declined by the Colombian people, Santos used his presidential powers to modify it and later passed it through a leftist Senate and House that caused for much of the outrage within the Colombian people. The peace treaty was not put into vote, as Santos saw his credibility being lost. Many U.S. senators like Marco Rubio from Florida opposed the peace treaty as it brought terrorists into power. Another country that is being watched by the world is Venezuela. Venezuela is infamous for its outrageous leaders, ex-President Hugo Chavez and the current Nicolás Maduro. Both dictators are known for breaking and creating relationship with the world's top powers, USA, Cuba, Russia, Spain, to name a few. While Hugo Chavez was in power, Venezuela transformed itself into the people's country. Hugo Chavez is famous for standing at a podium and speaking about how his country voted for him into power because he was one of them. Although Venezuelans love their president, many, including the U.S. and Spain, disliked him for his outspokenness and linking to communism. When ex-President Hugo Chavez passed away was when the real trouble began for this country. Under the command of Nicolás Maduro, many foreign relationships were broken, including the already rocked one with Colombia. Maduro closed Venezuela's borders to Colombia and mistreated and deported numerous Colombian natives. This caused an uproar within Colombian and international community. Today, Venezuela is in deep trouble. Many of its citizens are starving and lacking of adequate medical attention. How can it be such an oil-rich country and have such low living conditions? Recently, Nicolás Maduro has had a great backlash, including that of the OEA. The OEA criticized the dictator and demanded reform. Nicolás Maduro responded by criticizing the organization and completely separating Venezuela from the organization. This move completely shattered international relations, resulting many countries removing their ambassadors from Venezuela.
Now, moving forward to China and Latin American relations. China and Latin American relations have grown increasingly stronger throughout the years. The volume of exchange of goods from 2000 to 2013 increased by 21 times. China has a lot of economic interest in Latin America, and this is due to the fact that they can potentially invest in their products, find new sources of energy, depend on Latin America's oil and raw materials and minerals, as well as create new markets for infrastructure and trade amongst each other. And China has even increased their loans to some Latin American countries greatly by billions throughout the years. Not only is trade a part of Latin America and China relations, technology and education is too. China is promoting their technological advances in America, which pushes Latin America and some of its countries to become more modernized. China is also promoting education in Latin America as well. Not only that, China is also promoting more Latin American oriented classes in their educational system in China, which was never offered before. China and Latin America are building relationships built on trust, equality, understanding, and justice. In China's international policy regarding Latin America, they claim that they will advance and promote democracy as well as law within the country. They want their relationships and agreements, policies, whatever it may be, with each other to positively impact both China and Latin America. Let's focus on Chile's relations with China. China is extremely interested and dependent upon Chile's raw materials. Recently, Chile and China have traded so much that Chile has become the second largest trade exporter and importer with China, with making America the first with China. 55% of Chile's exports are to China, and 80% of those exports are raw materials and minerals. As stated before, China is heavily dependent on them. The relations between Chile and China are going so well that Chile and China want to begin some sort of free trade agreement amongst each other. Venezuela also shares strong ties with China. Venezuela is rich in oil, and China is extremely interested in it. So interested that China even is working on building an oil refinery in Venezuela. President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela agreed to increase the exports of oil to China in order for China to increase their loans to Venezuela. Venezuela wanted China to increase their loans by almost 4 billion, so that Venezuela could build more infrastructure, more roads, more factories in order to modernize not only their economy, but Venezuela as a whole. Venezuela's promise to export more oil to China is seen as a win-win situation for both countries. China is getting the oil that they want in large amounts daily from Venezuela, and Venezuela is getting the financial aid that they want from China in order to boost their economy and their society in general. Now, this relates back to China and Latin America wanting to both positively impact both countries, and this is definitely the case in Venezuela. Moving on, their relations are more of a business concern that are more oriented with market and trade, rather than politically oriented or motivated concerns. However, the relations between China and Latin America seem perfect, and China has even agreed to promote democracy as stated before, but there is room for concern. Although China and Latin America have agreed to stay out of each other's political affairs, that could be hard to do when you have such close ties with a certain country. As known, China is a communist country, while most of Latin America has moved towards a path to democracy. China's large loans to Latin America can be seen as dangerous and also a threat to their democracy. Without being careful, Latin America can begin to adapt communist like ways in their nation when they have such close ties to a communist nation like China. It's also concerning that there is a Chinese military presence in Latin America because that too could also spread communism throughout Latin American countries. However, in conclusion, although there are some concerns with China and Latin American relations deepening, such as the spread of communism, overall the relationship seems to have benefited most Latin American countries and Latin America as a whole.
As you can see, relations with Latin America and the US have most definitely had their ups and downs. It is no secret that most of the Latin American countries see the US as an authoritative figure, and although this is not always seen as a good thing, aid from the United States have prevented several crises in the region, whether it's financial or political. I'll just go a little bit into detail to show how, in Colombia, the United States intervened with the drug trafficking problem with Plan Colombia and how it decreased the growth of the drug trade in that region significantly. In Venezuela, he talks about the growing political tensions with Hugo Chavez and his social regime. Alejandro follows up with his description of the fight against drug lord Pablo Escobar in Colombia. He does a great job of going into detail with each U.S. presidential administration's involvement with the fight on drugs in Colombia. China, on the other hand, is a partner that will only grow and hopefully assist in furthering the progression of these states to a more modern society and economy. Eggy takes us into detail with how they are helping promote technology and education in the region, and more specifically in Chile. In conclusion, Latin America has a lot to offer to the world. It is crucial for not only the United States and China to keep close relations, but also other countries around the globe.